Zekthara stood before the massive viewing screen in the Coalition Council chambers, watching the swirling colors of the Nexus Nebula dance across the crystal walls. The crystalline being had covered wars across 17 star systems, documenting battles with the cold precision that made the Veltar species perfect war correspondents. Their transparent body caught the light from distant stars, creating patterns that shifted with each thought. The council speaker, a towering figure from the aquatic Delmari race, moved forward with fluid grace. War correspondent Zekthara, we have a special assignment for you. The water-filled suit that kept the Delmari alive made every word bubble and echo. The humans have been fighting the Krex Empire for 6 months now. We need a complete report on their military capabilities. Zekthara's crystalline form shifted slightly, the equivalent of nodding. The journalist had heard about humans but never encountered them directly. They were a relatively new species in the galactic community, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 50 years ago. Most reports described them as primitive but determined, nothing particularly special compared to the hundreds of species that made up the coalition. The humans interest the Council because they have been surprisingly effective. Against the Krex, the speaker continued. These insectoid warriors have conquered 12 systems in the past decade. No single species has been able to stand against them for more than a few weeks. Yet the humans have not only held their ground but have begun pushing the Krex back. The assignment seemed routine to Zekthara. Document their tactics, analyze their weapons, report on their command structure. The Veltar had done this countless times before. War was predictable, following patterns that any experienced correspondent could recognize. Species fought for resources, territory, or dominance. They used similar strategies based on their biology and technology. The humans would be no different. 3 days later, Zekthara materialized aboard the human battleship UNS Liberty through the Coalition's standard transport beam. The first thing that struck the correspondent was how crude everything looked. The corridors were plain metal lit by simple white lights, no elegant curves or artistic flourishes that marked advanced civilizations. Everything seemed built for function rather than beauty. Captain Jake Morrison met Zekthara in the transport bay. The human was tall by his species standards, with short brown hair and green eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His uniform was practical, dark blue with simple rank insignia. When he spoke, his voice carried an odd quality that Zekthara couldn't identify. "Welcome aboard the Liberty," Morrison said, extending his hand in the human greeting gesture. "I've been told you're here to observe our operations against the Krex." Zekthara extended a crystalline appendage to briefly touch the human's hand. The contact was strange, warm, and soft compared to the hard surfaces the Veltar were used to. "That is correct, Captain. The Coalition Council wishes to understand human military doctrine." Morrison's expression changed slightly, something that might have been amusement. "Military doctrine, right. Well, you'll get to see it firsthand soon enough. We're heading to the Kepler sector, where the Krex have established a stronghold." The captain led Zekthara through the ship, explaining various systems and introducing crew members. Lieutenant Amy Brooks, the tactical officer, was a young woman with blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her blue eyes were sharp and focused as she briefed Zekthara on the upcoming mission. "The Krex have fortified 3 asteroid bases in the sector," Brooks explained, pointing to a holographic display. "Standard tactics would be to lay siege and wait them out, but we don't have that kind of time. They're using the bases to launch raids on civilian shipping." Zekthara studied the tactical display. The asteroids were heavily defended with energy shields and weapon platforms. Any direct assault would result in massive casualties. "What approach will you take?" Brooks and Morrison exchanged a look that Zekthara didn't understand. "We'll show you," Morrison said simply. The next morning, the Liberty dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Kepler sector. Zekthara was on the bridge, recording everything for the report. The Krex bases appeared on the main screen, exactly as described. 3 large asteroids bristling with weapons surrounded by patrol ships. The initial engagement seemed normal. The Liberty and 2 escort frigates approached in standard formation, weapons powered but not yet firing. The Krex responded predictably, sending out their patrol ships to intercept. Energy beams and missile volleys were exchanged at long range, neither side committing to close combat. Zekthara began composing mental notes about human tactical competence. They followed galactic warfare protocols, maintained proper formation discipline, and used their weapons efficiently. Nothing remarkable, nothing that would explain their success against the Kreks. Then everything changed. One of the escort frigates, the UNS Defender, suffered a critical hit that knocked out its main engines. Instead of withdrawing as standard doctrine demanded, the ship's captain did something unexpected. He used his maneuvering thrusters to point his disabled vessel directly at the nearest Kreks base and fired every weapon simultaneously. The Kreks patrol ships moved to intercept, but the Defender's sacrifice created an opening. Morrison immediately ordered the Liberty forward at maximum speed, diving through the gap in the Kreks formation. "All hands prepare for boarding action," his voice echoed through the ship. Zekthara watched in fascination as human Marines prepared for close combat. They moved with quiet efficiency, checking weapons and equipment. What struck the correspondent was their faces. There was no fear, no excitement, just a calm determination that seemed almost mechanical. The Liberty crashed through the Kreks base's outer defenses and latched onto the main structure. Airlocks were cut open and the Marines poured through. Zekthara followed, wearing a protective environmental suit that allowed movement in the artificial atmosphere. Inside the Kreks base, the correspondent expected to see standard boarding action. Species typically fought room by room using cover and superior numbers to advance. What Zekthara saw instead was something entirely different. The Kreks deployed their most feared weapon, a chemical compound that induced paralyzing terror in most sentient species. The air filled with pheromones designed to shut down logical thought and trigger flight responses. Zekthara felt the effects immediately, a crushing sense of dread that made thinking difficult. But the humans seemed completely unaffected. If anything, they became more focused. Sergeant Danny Walsh led his squad through corridors filled with the terror weapon, moving with mechanical precision. They didn't speak unnecessarily or waste motion. Each movement had purpose, each shot was deliberate. Zekthara followed Walsh's squad as they systematically cleared the base. The Kreks defenders, confident in their chemical weapon, were caught completely off guard. They had never encountered a species that could resist their fear-inducers. The insectoid warriors fell back in confusion, their tactical advantage neutralized. Within 2 hours, the base was secured. The other 2 asteroids surrendered without further resistance when they realized their primary weapon was useless. Zekthara began writing the first report entries, noting the humans' apparent immunity to psychological warfare. That night, as the Liberty traveled back to human space, Zekthara interviewed several crew members. The responses were troubling in their consistency. When asked about the fear pheromones, the humans seemed genuinely puzzled by the question. "Fear?" Walsh had said, scratching his head. "I mean, sure, I was scared. But that's just part of the job. You don't let it stop you from doing what needs to be done." Zekthara realized this was just the beginning. The Veltar correspondent had seen something that didn't fit standard galactic warfare patterns, and the implications were disturbing. These humans didn't just resist the Kreks' psychological weapons, they seemed to treat fear as merely another tactical consideration. The report was going to be more complicated than expected. 3 weeks into the assignment, Zekthara had begun to understand human military routine. The crew of the UNS Liberty followed predictable patterns, maintained their equipment with care, and showed the same professional competence found in any coalition fleet. The crystalline correspondent was preparing what seemed like a straightforward report when everything changed. Emergency klaxon woke Zekthara from the meditation cycle that served as sleep for the Veltar species. Red lights flashed through the corridors as crew members ran to battle stations. The correspondent quickly made way to the bridge where Captain Morrison stood studying a tactical display with grim concentration. "What is the situation?" Zekthara asked Lieutenant Brooks, who was rapidly working at her station. Brooks looked up with an expression that the correspondent had never seen on a human face before. It wasn't fear exactly, but something deeper and more dangerous. "Distress call from the colony ship Aurora's Dream. They're under attack by a Kreks fleet in the Ross system." The tactical display showed the situation in stark detail. The Aurora's Dream was a massive civilian vessel carrying 15,000 human colonists to a new world. It was being attacked by a Kreks fleet of 15 heavy cruisers and dozens of smaller ships. The colony ship had minimal defenses and was essentially helpless. "Our response time?" Morrison asked. 40 minutes at maximum speed, Brooks replied. Morrison studied the display for a long moment. Any military commander in the galaxy would recognize this as a hopeless situation. The Liberty was alone with only 2 escort frigates for support. Even if they arrived in time, 3 ships against a full Krex fleet was suicide. Standard protocol demanded calling for reinforcements and hoping to arrive in time to rescue survivors. Instead, Morrison spoke words that would haunt Zekthara for the rest of the correspondent's existence. Today we remind them why predators fear the prey that fights back. He turned to his crew with an expression that made Zekthara's crystalline form resonate with unease. All hands to battle stations. Prepare for immediate acceleration to combat speed. The Liberty and its escorts jumped to faster-than-light travel, racing toward a battle they could not possibly win. During the journey, Zekthara watched the crew prepare with methodical efficiency. But something was different from the previous engagement. The humans moved with the same calm precision, but there was an undercurrent of something that made the correspondent deeply uncomfortable. When they dropped back into normal space near the Aurora's Dream, the situation was even worse than the tactical display had indicated. The colony ship was heavily damaged, atmosphere streaming from multiple hull breaches. Krex ships swarmed around it like insects around wounded prey, firing into the helpless vessel. What happened next violated every principle of civilized warfare that Zekthara knew. Instead of attempting to negotiate or calling for reinforcements, Morrison immediately ordered an attack. But this wasn't the careful, measured assault the correspondent had observed before. The Liberty dove directly into the center of the Krex formation at maximum speed, weapons firing continuously. One of the escort frigates, the UNS Ranger, was hit by concentrated fire and suffered critical damage to its reactor core. Instead of evacuating the crew, the captain did something that shocked Zekthara to the core. "This is Captain Peters," came the voice over the communication system. "Ranger is going critical. We're taking as many of these bugs with us as possible." The damaged frigate accelerated directly toward the largest Krex cruiser, using its failing reactor as a weapon. The explosion when the Ranger struck the Krex ship was visible across the entire battle zone. Both vessels were completely destroyed, but the psychological effect on the Krex fleet was immediate. The insectoid species had never encountered an enemy that would deliberately sacrifice their own ships as weapons. Meanwhile, the Liberty was fighting in a way that defied all tactical logic. Morrison ordered his ship into close-range combat, where the superior numbers of the Krex fleet should have been decisive. But instead of being overwhelmed, the human ship seemed to thrive in the chaos. Zekthara watched in growing horror as the humans began implementing tactics that no civilized species would consider. When conventional weapons proved insufficient, they began jury-rigging mining explosives from the cargo hold into improvised bombs. Engineering teams worked frantically to convert ship systems into weapons. The correspondent observed Chief Engineer Karen Blake, directing her teams with calm efficiency as they turned the ship's fusion reactor into a massive directed energy weapon. "We need to overload the containment field in a controlled burst," she explained to her teams. "It'll probably burn out half our systems, but it'll punch through their shields." When the makeshift weapon fired, it carved through 2 Krex cruisers like they were made of paper. But the effort left the Liberty crippled, drifting with minimal power and failing life support. Any rational crew would have surrendered or attempted to evacuate. The humans did neither. Instead, Marine Corporal Lisa Martinez led her squad in what she called making the bastards work for every inch. The Krex, sensing victory, moved to board the disabled human ship. They expected to find demoralized survivors ready to surrender. What they found was something entirely different. Martinez and her Marines had turned the ship's interior into a nightmare maze of booby traps and ambush points. They flooded sections with radiation from the damaged reactor, making areas lethal to the insectoid boarders. They used the ship's internal systems as weapons, turning air recyclers into chemical dispensers and gravity generators into crushing traps. Zekthara followed the action through security monitors, watching in fascination and horror as the humans fought with a creativity that bordered on madness. When Krex warriors attempted to use their superior numbers to overwhelm defensive positions, the Marines simply collapsed entire sections of the ship on top of them. "Why are they not retreating?" Zekthara asked Lieutenant Brooks, who was coordinating the defense from the bridge. Brooks looked at the correspondent with those sharp blue eyes that seemed to see everything. "Retreat to where? These are our people on that colony ship. This is our ship. This is where we make our stand. The battle continued for hours, with the humans turning every disadvantage into a weapon. When the Kreks cut power to sections of the ship, the Marines used the darkness for ambushes. When the insectoids deployed their fear pheromones, the humans seemed to become more focused rather than less. Zekthara began to understand that something fundamental about human warfare was different from every other species in the galaxy. They didn't fight to win territory or resources. They fought with the desperation of cornered animals, but maintained the intelligence and creativity of an advanced species. The turning point came when Martinez's squad discovered that the Kreks had been using sections of the Aurora's dream to hold human prisoners. The change in the Marines was immediate and terrifying. The controlled aggression that had characterized the battle suddenly transformed into something primal and unstoppable. "Command. This is Martinez," came the voice over the communication system, cold and mechanical. "We found evidence of prisoner abuse. Request permission to implement Protocol 7. Morrison's response was immediate. "Permission granted." No quarter. Zekthara had never heard of Protocol 7, but its effects were obvious. The humans stopped trying to disable or capture Kreks boarders. They began hunting them through the ship with methodical brutality, cutting off retreat routes and forcing the insectoids into smaller and smaller pockets of resistance. When Kreks reinforcements attempted to board from their remaining ships, they found that the humans had somehow turned the Liberty into a trap. Every airlock, every corridor, every room had been transformed into a killing ground, designed to extract the maximum cost from any invader. The battle ended when the remaining Kreks ships simply fled. They had superior numbers, better weapons, and tactical advantage, but they could not overcome an enemy that refused to accept defeat. The Aurora's dream was saved, though both it and the Liberty were barely functional. In the aftermath, Zekthara interviewed survivors from both ships. The colonists spoke of their rescuers with a mixture of gratitude and awe that troubled the correspondent. They described the human military with words that seemed more appropriate for natural disasters than sentient beings. More disturbing were the interviews with the Liberty's crew. When asked about the battle, they spoke of it with the same professional detachment they might use to describe routine maintenance. The fact that they had fought impossible odds and won seemed unremarkable to them. Sergeant Walsh, when asked about Protocol 7, simply shrugged. "When they hurt civilians, especially kids, the rules change. We make sure they understand that some things have consequences." Zekthara realized that the preliminary report was completely wrong. The humans hadn't won despite being outnumbered 15-1. They had won because being outnumbered made them more dangerous, not less. When cornered, they didn't break or surrender. They became something else entirely. The correspondent began rewriting the report, struggling to find words to describe what had been witnessed. This wasn't warfare as the galaxy understood it. This was something far older and more terrible, dressed in the technology of an advanced civilization. The Battle of Proxima Station represented everything wrong with the galactic situation. Zekthara stood on the bridge of the UNS Defiant flagship of Admiral Helen Cooper, watching the largest space battle in Coalition history unfold. The crystalline correspondent had been reassigned from ground operations to observe what military analysts were calling the decisive engagement of the war. Proxima Station was the Kreks, Empire's primary stronghold, a massive space fortress built into an asteroid that served as their command center for the entire sector. The Coalition had assembled the largest fleet in its history to break the Kreks' hold on the region. 12 different species had contributed ships and crews to the effort. The battle began according to standard galactic warfare doctrine. The Coalition fleet approached in formation, with each species maintaining their traditional tactical positions. The Veltar provided long-range scanning and communication support. The Delmari contributed their advanced shield technology. The insectoid Threks offered their expertise in swarm tactics. Admiral Cooper commanded the human contingent from the center of the formation. Her ships distributed throughout the fleet to provide coordination and support. Zekthara had spent the previous month aboard the Defiant, observing Cooper's command style and trying to understand human military leadership. Cooper was a woman in her 50s with gray hair and dark eyes that seemed to calculate odds with every glance. She ran her fleet with the same methodical precision that characterized all human military operations. During peacetime exercises, her ships performed exactly as expected from any competent naval force. But Zekathara had learned that humans were different when the stakes became existential. The correspondent had seen them transform during the Aurora's dream rescue and the Tau Ceti Prime liberation. Now, watching the largest battle of the war, Zekathara waited to see if the pattern would hold. The Kreks had prepared their ultimate defense for Proxima Station. As the Coalition fleet closed to combat range, they deployed their newest weapon, a biological virus that could be transmitted through communication systems and life support networks. The virus was designed to turn Coalition species against each other by inducing paranoia and aggression. The effect was immediate and devastating. Veltar ships began losing formation as their crystalline minds fractured under artificial stress. Delamari crews became paralyzed by fear that made rational thought impossible. The Threk swarm tactics collapsed as individual ships began attacking their own allies. Within minutes, the carefully coordinated Coalition fleet dissolved into chaos. Ships that had been working together for months suddenly found themselves unable to trust their own sensors or communications. The virus turned every advantage of cooperative warfare into a liability. Zekathara watched the disaster unfold from the Defiance Bridge, feeling the effects of the biological weapon despite the ship's human-designed filters. The correspondent's normally clear thought processes became clouded with suspicion and dread. Every sound seemed threatening, every shadow potentially hostile. But the humans seemed completely unaffected. If anything, they became more focused as the virus spread through the fleet. Admiral Cooper's response to the biological attack was immediate and chilling. All human vessels, this is Admiral Cooper. Implement Protocol Omega. We are assuming fleet command. When Zekathara asked what Protocol Omega meant, Cooper's explanation sent shivers through the correspondent's crystalline form. You can't make humans more paranoid than we already are. We've been fighting each other for millennia. This is just Tuesday for us. What followed was the systematic destruction of everything Zekathara believed about the nature of civilized warfare. The humans didn't just resist the virus that was tearing apart the Coalition fleet. They used their immunity to take complete control of the battle. Human ships began moving throughout the formation, using their unaffected crews to manually coordinate other species' vessels. They bypassed compromised communication systems by using physical signals and direct ship-to-ship contact. Most disturbing of all, they began implementing tactics that no galactic military academy would ever teach. Commander Rick Barnes led a strike force that didn't just destroy Krek ships but systematically hunted down their crews. His squadron used boarding pods to breach enemy vessels, then proceeded to eliminate every living creature aboard. When Zekathara questioned this apparent overkill, Barnes's response was cold and final. We're not just fighting this war, we're making sure our kids never have to fight it again. The humans began displaying coordination that seemed impossible for individual vessels. They moved in patterns that suggested hive mind thinking, while maintaining the initiative and creativity that marked them as individuals. Their tactical responses showed pattern recognition that bordered on prescient knowledge of enemy movements, but it was their capacity for escalation that truly terrified Zekathara. As the battle progressed and Krek's resistance stiffened, the humans didn't just increase their firepower or commit more resources. They began implementing strategies that defied rational cost-benefit analysis. When Krek's defenders used civilian hostages as shields, the human response was to eliminate the threat regardless of collateral damage. When the insectoids deployed chemical weapons that would contaminate entire star systems, Cooper's forces didn't retreat or attempt to neutralize the weapons safely. They flew directly into the contaminated zones and destroyed the weapons at point-blank range. The turning point came when long-range sensors detected a massive energy signature approaching from the edge of the system. The Kreks had deployed their ultimate weapon, a planet-killer device aimed directly at Earth itself. The message was clear: surrender or watch their homeworld die. The human response was immediate and absolute. Every human ship in the fleet simultaneously abandoned defensive positions and formed up for a direct assault on the doomsday weapon. They didn't attempt negotiation or look for tactical alternatives. The decision was made in seconds and implemented without hesitation. Admiral Cooper's final transmission to the fleet was burned into Zekathara's memory forever. All ships, this is Cooper. Earth dies over our dead bodies. No retreat, no surrender, no quarter. Make them remember why they should have left us alone. What followed was the most brutal space engagement Zekthara had ever witnessed. The humans charged directly at the planet-killer device, accepting certain death to prevent Earth's destruction. They used their ships as kinetic weapons, ramming them into Krek's vessels at maximum speed. They overloaded their reactors to create massive explosions that carved through enemy formations. The correspondent watched in horror as the UNS Valiant, commanded by Captain Linda Scott, flew directly into the Doomsday weapon's main cannon while firing every weapon simultaneously. The explosion when the ship struck the device was visible across the entire star system, but it wasn't enough to stop the weapon. Ship after ship followed Scott's example, each crew making the same impossible choice. They could retreat and let Earth die, or they could die trying to save their homeworld. For humans, it wasn't really a choice at all. The final assault was led by Admiral Cooper herself. The Defiant, heavily damaged and leaking atmosphere, made the last run at the Planet Killer's control center. Cooper's voice remained calm and professional even as her ship disintegrated around her. "This is Admiral Cooper to all Coalition forces. The weapon is neutralized. Earth is safe. It has been an honor serving with you." The Doomsday device was destroyed, but at a cost that staggered the imagination. The entire human fleet was gone, over 50,000 crew members dead in less than 2 hours. The humans had won, but they had paid a price that would have broken any other species. In the aftermath, as rescue ships searched for survivors, Zekthara found Admiral Cooper in the medical bay of a Coalition rescue vessel. The Admiral was dying from radiation exposure, her body failing from the damage sustained during the final assault. Cooper's final interview was conducted in a sterile white room that smelled of antiseptic and approaching death. Her voice was weak, but her eyes remained sharp and focused. When Zekthara asked why the humans had been willing to sacrifice everything, Cooper's answer was simple and terrible. "Because it's what we do. When something threatens what we love, we don't calculate odds or weigh costs. We remove the threat. That's what makes us human." Cooper died 3 days later, but her words haunted Zekthara long after the funeral ceremonies ended. The correspondent realized that the humans hadn't just won a military victory at Proxima Station. They had demonstrated something that would reshape the galaxy's understanding of warfare itself. The humans didn't view military conflict as a political tool or territorial dispute. They saw it as an existential struggle, where the only acceptable outcome was the complete elimination of the threat to their survival. They were willing to pay any price, accept any sacrifice, to protect what they considered theirs. But most terrifying of all was the realization that humans didn't just fight this way when defending Earth. They fought this way for any world, any people, any cause they had claimed as their responsibility. The species that had emerged from a single planet was treating the entire galaxy as their extended family. Zekthara began to understand why the Krek spoke of humans with such fear. Zekthara stood in the council chambers 6 months after the Battle of Proxima Station, staring at the completed report that would reshape galactic understanding forever. The crystalline correspondent had returned to the Coalition homeworld, struggling with how to document what had been witnessed. The formal military analysis requested by the Council had become something far more significant and terrifying. The war against the Krek's empire was officially over. The insectoid species had surrendered completely after Proxima Station, abandoning their conquered territories and retreating to designated reservation worlds under Coalition protection. But Zekthara knew that the real story wasn't the end of one conflict, but the beginning of something unprecedented in galactic history. The report lay before the correspondent in its final form, no longer the straightforward tactical analysis originally requested. Instead, it read like a warning about the emergence of a species that didn't just wage war but embodied it when threatened. The document detailed encounters that challenged every assumption about civilized conflict. The council speaker approached with the fluid movements characteristic of the Delmari species, water-filled suit gleaming under the chamber's lights. War correspondent Zekthara, the council is eager to review your analysis of human military capabilities. Your preliminary reports have been quite illuminating. Zekthara's crystalline form shifted in what might have been reluctance. The preliminary reports had been sanitized versions of the truth, carefully edited to avoid causing panic among Coalition leadership. The full report contained observations that would fundamentally alter how every species viewed humanity. Honored Speaker, the complete analysis presents findings that extend beyond conventional military assessment. Zekthara began carefully. The humans do not approach warfare as other species understand it. The speaker gestured for elaboration with movements that sent ripples through the liquid medium of his suit. Please explain your conclusions. Zekthara activated the holographic display that had taken months to prepare. Images from the Aurora's dream rescue, the Tau Ceti Prime liberation, and the Proxima station battle filled the chamber. But it wasn't the tactical data that mattered. It was the behavioral patterns that defied standard military doctrine. The humans view warfare not as political extension, but as existential struggle, Zekthara explained, watching the council speaker's reaction carefully. They do not fight for territory or resources in the conventional sense. They fight to eliminate threats to their survival and the survival of those they consider family. The first section of the report detailed what Zekthara had come to call human escalation doctrine. Every species in the galaxy had limits, points beyond which they would not go regardless of potential gains. Humans appeared to have no such limitations when they perceived existential threats. At Aurora's dream, faced with impossible odds, they used their own ships as kinetic weapons, Zekthara continued. At Tau Ceti Prime, they implemented psychological warfare that systematically destroyed enemy morale. At Proxima Station, they sacrificed their entire fleet to prevent a single planet's destruction. But it was the pattern underlying these actions that truly disturbed the correspondent. Humans didn't just escalate in response to enemy actions. They escalated in anticipation of future threats, striking with overwhelming force to prevent potential conflicts rather than react to actual ones. The report included detailed interviews with human survivors, conversations that revealed the thinking behind their tactical decisions. Admiral Cooper's final words echoed through Zekthara's memory. Because it's what we do. When something threatens what we love, we don't calculate odds or weigh costs. We remove the threat. The council speaker studied the holographic displays with growing unease. These tactics seem unnecessarily brutal for achieving military objectives. That is the critical misunderstanding, Zekthara replied. Humans are not trying to achieve military objectives in the conventional sense. They are implementing what they call permanent solutions to perceived threats. The second section of the report addressed human psychological warfare capabilities. Other species used fear as a tactical tool, employing it to gain temporary advantages or force favorable negotiations. Humans used fear as a strategic weapon, designing their actions to create lasting terror that would prevent future conflicts. The liberation of Tau Ceti Prime provided the clearest example. Instead of simply defeating the Krex forces, the humans had systematically documented every atrocity committed against human prisoners. They had distributed these records throughout known space, ensuring that every species understood the consequences of harming humans. They call this educational protocols, Zekthara explained. The purpose is not revenge but prevention. They want potential enemies to understand that certain actions will result in absolute consequences. The most chilling section of the report dealt with human coordination capabilities. During the Proxima Station battle, when other species fell victim to Krex psychological weapons, humans had not only resisted but had used their immunity to coordinate the entire coalition fleet. This suggested that humans possessed natural resistance to mental manipulation that bordered on the supernatural. More disturbing was their apparent ability to function as both individuals and collective entities, switching between modes as tactical situations demanded. They demonstrate pattern recognition that approaches prescience, Zekthara noted. Their tactical responses suggest they can predict enemy actions with accuracy that defies conventional analysis. But it was the final section of the report that contained the most terrifying revelation. Through interviews with liberated prisoners and captured Krex soldiers, Zekthara had learned that the insectoid species had been studying humans for decades before the war began. The Krex had identified humans as persistence predators, evolved hunters who succeeded not through superior speed or strength, but through relentless pursuit and unlimited endurance. What the Krex had failed to understand was how those traits would translate to technological warfare. The Krex called humans the species that doesn't know when to die, Zekthara explained. They observed that humans became more dangerous when wounded rather than less, that they treated any attack on their group as an attack on themselves personally. The correspondent had come to understand that human warfare wasn't an aberration or cultural quirk. It was the natural expression of a species that had evolved as the galaxy's most successful social predator, now equipped with advanced technology and motivated by ethical codes that made them virtually unstoppable. The council speaker remained silent for long moments, studying the data with obvious concern. When he finally spoke, his voice carried undertones that made the water in his suit ripple with agitation. "What do you recommend regarding future relations with humanity?" Zekthara's response had been carefully considered over months of analysis and reflection. The coalition should never, under any circumstances, give humanity reason to view us as an existential threat. They should be treated as permanent allies, not temporary partners. The report's conclusion was stark and uncompromising. Humans represented a fundamental shift in the nature of galactic warfare. They had introduced concepts of absolute commitment and unlimited escalation that made traditional military calculations obsolete. "They do not fight wars," Zekthara stated in the final summary. "They eliminate threats. The distinction is crucial for understanding future human behavior." The council speaker accepted the report with obvious reluctance. "This analysis will be classified at the highest levels. Only coalition leadership will have access to these findings." As Zekthara left the council chambers, the correspondent reflected on the journey that had led to this moment. The assignment had begun as a routine military assessment, documenting the capabilities of a promising new coalition member. It had become something far more significant. The report would be read by leaders who needed to understand that humanity wasn't just another species with useful military capabilities. They were the galaxy's first example of a technological species that retained the predatory instincts that had made them dominant on their homeworld. Years passed before Zekthara saw the full impact of the report. The Krex Empire was dismantled completely, its surviving members relocated to protected worlds where they could live safely under coalition supervision. But the real change was in how other species approached relations with humanity. Trade agreements were honored scrupulously. Territorial disputes were resolved through negotiation rather than force. No species wanted to give humans reason to view them as threats requiring permanent solutions. Zekthara never again covered warfare, instead spending the remainder of their career documenting human culture, art, and philosophy. The correspondent sought to understand how the same species capable of such terrible efficiency in warfare also created beauty that moved souls across the galaxy. The assignment had ended, but its impact continued to resonate through galactic civilization. Humanity had taught the universe a fundamental truth about the nature of warfare and the price of threatening those who refused to accept defeat. In quiet moments, Zekthara would remember Admiral Cooper's final words and understand their true meaning.